everyone, and good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here for this afternoon's lecture. So we're just waiting for everyone to come in from the registrations. So very quick welcomes to our students who are here. We're also just waiting for some setup. So while we get everything in order, please just stand by, make sure to sign the attendance sheets, and we'll start in about 3 minutes. Okay, so hello again, everybody. Today we're going to have a very special lecture by a guest who's coming to Baguio from elsewhere. So our flow of the program today is going to be very simple. We're going to have some opening remarks, and then Sir Ariel is going to give the talk. And then afterwards, there's going to be a section for questions and answers, just in case you guys have anything specifically you want to learn more about in reference to the talk. So once again, for those people who just got in, please make sure to sign the attendance sheet outside if you haven't already, or make sure to drop by the attendance sheet before you leave later on. Okay, so today's talk is for the college, really. It's a public lecture and it's open to social science students, mostly history majors. Today, we're going to have a 1.5-hour lecture, more or less, by Dr. Ariel Lopez on Treaties and Indigenous Political Interests in Mindanao and Sulawesi from around 1700 to 1900. Now, without any further ado, I'm going to be welcoming our Dean of the College of Social Sciences to give a few opening remarks for today's event. So here is our Dean, Ma'am Leia Abayao, to give us a few remarks. So let's give her a round of applause.
Good afternoon! Kumusta kayo? Si Ma'am Nella sumasagot sa akin. History majors dito. Wala? History majors? Wala, pinag-shift na kayo ni Ma'am Nella. History 1? Andito rin? History 1? Ay, wow! Cute. So, magandang hapon muli at to all of you, students and colleagues at CSS, I am very delighted to welcome you to this lecture on Treaties and Indigenous Political Interests in Mindanao and Sulawesi. I'd like to begin by expressing my sincerest thanks to Dr. Ariel Lopez for accepting this invitation to do a lecture. I know that he's a very busy faculty, a researcher, an associate professor of the Asian Center, Diliman, and we are honored to have him with us today. And secondly, I would like to express also my gratitude to the Faculty of History for organizing this lecture in such a very short time. This lecture is an important platform in our efforts to provide a wide range of student learning experience at the College of Social Sciences. For BAS history majors and our students in Philippine history, you know how our faculty would work to provide you with exceptional opportunities to learn and have a pleasant experience in learning the courses being taught. Special topics such as this on treaties and indigenous political interests in Mindanao and Sulawesi shall broaden your views on Mindanao in the Philippines and deepen your knowledge on the Philippines in Southeast Asia. There's more to learn about the Philippines from Dr. Ariel's research and teaching experience, so I wish you a wonderful lecture and discussion with Dr. Ariel Lopez. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dean Leia. Now, to formally introduce our speaker today, we're going to call upon our department chair for the Department of History and Philosophy, Dr. Maria Nella Florendo. Yeah, let's give her a round of applause.
Good afternoon, everyone. I see familiar faces, but I mean familiar because they're the older ones. But I also see new faces. It is with pleasure that I take on this task of introducing our speaker this afternoon, a very accomplished young scholar. Young kasi kung tinignan ko yung, binalikan ko yung CV niya eh. Nag-rally na ako sa EDSA, hindi pa siya pinanganak. A very accomplished young scholar who's currently a tenured associate professor at the Asian Center of UP Diliman. And he currently handles History 254 under the MA History program of UP College Baguio. He's our affiliate faculty, and we're very happy about that appointment, and we're very proud he accepted that appointment. So while I do not usually use introductions as some form of a litany to give everything that's in the bio curriculum vitae of a person, I think I need to give justice to this very accomplished young scholar. Let me start by saying that he finished his BA History summa cum laude at UP Diliman. You match that, history major. Then he proceeded to take another BA History, an advanced degree at the at the Leiden University until he finished his PhD, so master's PhD in 2018 in the same university. I must say that he's has made a lot of presentations nationally and internationally. Is a published scholar. I would say that he has in fact carved his niche particularly in the history of Southeast Asia, having chosen to focus on maritime Southeast Asia. So, without further ado, I'd like all of us to welcome Dr. Ariel C. Lopez of the Asian Center.
Maraming salamat po, Professor Nela Florento. Very kind introduction. I hope we'll be able to fulfill the expectations of the students here. Also, thank you very much to Dean Bea Baya for the invitation, and of course, my good friend, Professor Annalyn Munoz, whom I shared an office hallway in Diliman several years ago. So it's a great privilege to speak in front of you today and to share with you my research project. It's a collaborative research project where I am involved in, and hopefully some of you of interest in history and in treaties, colonial treaties, might also get involved. Yeah? And so this is a project that has just started for me early this year. So I very much welcome suggestions, comments, questions. Next slide, please. So this presentation has two parts. First, introduction to the project, for which I directly quote from the project proposal, and second, a preliminary case study on treaty and treaty-making practices in colonial Philippines and Indonesia. So the material on which this presentation is based is called from a collaborative research project in global and diplomatic history, which investigates the often overlooked role of treaties in imperial expansion. By systematically analyzing all of the around 600 bilateral treaties concluded between a European or American imperial power and a Southeast Asian polity between around 1750 to 1920, the project aims to develop new theories for understanding modern imperialism. from 2022 to 2028, funded by the Swedish Research Council and based at Linnaeus University in Växjö, Sweden. So the project has 3 phases. The first part of the project studies the contents and character of the original treaty documents available in Asian, European, and American archives, and systematically analyzes the different translations and versions at hand, as well as the intercultural, literal, symbolic meanings of the treaties. The second part consists of an in-depth study of 12 to 15 treaty-making processes involving a sequence of treaties between 2 or more parties over a long period of time. For instance, treaty-making practices in Indonesia from late 18th to early 20th century. Based on first-hand archival sources, the research aims to unravel the motivations and priorities of different Asian, European, and American actors involved in the treaty negotiations. Finally, the project uses the empirical data to develop new theories and concepts. All available versions of the theories of the treaties will be published online, open access, with the results of the projects as part of the project's deliverables. This project thus contributes to spreading knowledge about some of the most fundamental source documents in the making of the modern world, whose influence continues to reverberate throughout our world today. Next slide, please. So at the heart of the project is the following pivotal research question. How did treaties and treaty making shape local political realities, intercultural relations, and imperialism in Southeast Asia from 1750 until 1920? The region of Southeast Asia is particularly apt for the investigation because of the rich opportunities for comparison and studies of interaction between different imperial powers and indigenous polities. Because of the geopolitical context, there was a high degree of interaction between the imperial powers as well as between many indigenous states and areas under imperial domination. These circumstances, combined with a great number of bilateral treaties, make Southeast Asia very rich in sources of relevance for understanding the global processes of imperial expansion and intercultural diplomacy in the modern era. The project sets out to challenge simplistic dichotomies between colonizer and colonized. It aims to highlight how different colonial policies and practices and local conditions all had a major impact on the character and development of imperial domination. It seeks to nuance the complexity of what we know or think we know about modern imperialism, and also provides explanations for the similarities and dissimilarities in imperial domination across time and space. It contributes to the ongoing debate in global history about the relationship between micro and macro levels and how to reconcile the study of global processes with the diversity of local historical experiences, actors, and perspectives. Next slide. So the project has an important empirical and societal mission. It will publish all treaties online, that is, the facsimiles and texts of the preserved original treaty documents, both in European and non-European languages, when available and allowed by the archives. This will be published by the project website, c.southeasia-treaties.org, which everyone is very welcome to visit, and I think it's up now. In doing so, the project will make it possible for the first time for anyone to study the original documents instead of relying on the frequently incomplete, abbreviated, or mistranslated published versions. The publication and dissemination of the sources with full online open access has the potential to stimulate further research on treaties and treaty making and enable researchers in Southeast Asia and across the world to access first-hand sources. Okay, now let me transition to more concrete examples in the Philippines and elsewhere. Slide, please. Historical treaties are relevant for many current issues of great social, economic, and political importance. For example, pertaining to sovereignty, national and regional borders, maritime disputes, land ownership, control over natural resources, and the control and political rights of indigenous peoples and ethnic minorities around the world. Now I leave the project proposal and go to my own research. Okay, historical treaties have continuing legal importance, not least for the Philippines and Malaysia, right? Whether if you probably you've encountered the news recently, whether the Sultan of Cebu at the time, Jamalul Alam, ceded or only leased Sabah to the British North Borneo Company in the Treaty of 1878. Recently, and widely reported in international media, a French court decided in favor of the family of the Sultan of Sulu in its legal claim over Sabah and demands Malaysia to pay to the tune of $14 billion. These pre-modern treaties have also served as sources for modern international law. For instance, the American colonial government of the Philippines lost to the Netherlands East Indies, the Dutch East Indies, in the case over the island of Miangas, Las Palmas, in 1928, in the Permanent Court of Arbitration. As the Dutch rulers of Indonesia at the time argued, their sovereignty, and I quote, arose out of conventions entered into the native princes of the Sangi Islands in the 17th century. Sangi Islands are the group of islands between Mindanao and Sulawesi. And actually this case in the 1920s was the first, I think, international case brought by the Philippines, American colonial government at the time, to the Permanent Court of Arbitration. And later on, we of course hear about the West Philippine Sea ruling. However, treaties between European and Southeast Asian states have not received scholarly attention that they deserve, and sometimes they're often dismissed. One strand of thought is that the cultural difference between Southeast Asians and Europeans, and by extension, their different understanding of the meaning of these treaties, and therefore, they have this inherent difference, that this cultural divide between the Europeans and Southeast Asians. For instance, Leonard Andaya, a historian in Hawaii, argues that the indigenous rulers of Eastern Indonesia had a different conception of early modern treaties at the time, with the Dutch specifically. The historiographical function of treaties seemed to be only the date of the treaty, which historians could conveniently use as a marker for the beginning of formal European subjugation of a region. Right? So it's like often convenient turning point, marker, date. This is the time when Europeans conquered the region. For example, it seems convenient to identify 1677 as the start of the VOC, the Dutch East India Company's rule or presence in North Sulawesi, when a Dutch governor Pat Kruger, engaged in a spree of treaty making with various polities, kingdoms in North Sulawesi, as a sign of formal supremacy over the territories formerly under the Sultan of Ternate. Finally, the importance of treaties in Southeast Asia has been drowned by the narratives of constant conflict between and subjugation of local rulers by the more organized and militarily superior Europeans. And this is especially true for the history of Spanish engagement with Mindanao. How many of us know the treaties between Spain and Sulu, or Spain with the Maranao Datus, or Spain with the Maguindanao Sultans or Datus? So next slide, please. So I will draw examples from this, I think, very interesting region of Sulawesi and Mindanao, showing the map. In the 18th century, to identify 4 themes on European and Southeast Asian interactions as reflected in treaty-making practices. Ising pa ba? Okay, the first theme that I'd like to emphasize is that there is a shared political interest in forging treaties. Next slide, please. So, for the Spanish, in the Philippines, it is cheaper to maintain forward bases like Zamboanga through treaties than through sheer force alone. For the local rulers, this could also be a political advantage. Signing a treaty with the Spanish could bestow legitimacy among the ruler's own people. Spain actively sought the alliance of various local rulers in upland and lowland Mindanao in the 18th century, before and even after the re-establishment of Zamboanga as a Spanish forward base in 1718, where military action became a more viable option because of proximity to nearby hostile Muslim territories. Spanish peaceful alliance with the various local chiefs in Mindanao was facilitated by the ruler of Maguindanao, the apical ruler of Maguindanao, the Sultan of Maguindanao. During the treaty signing in 1704, for instance, between Spain and the various upland chiefs of an upland kingdom called Huayan, it is notable that the Sultan of Mindanao was conspicuously present, even though he was not a party to the treaty. It was very likely that the Sultan's facilitating and hosting of the treaty signing only enhanced his status among his upland peers and perhaps also competitors, therefore increasing the prestige of his Lowland Sultanate. Spanish authorities in Zamboanga also relied on the Sulu Sultan, in this case Diliman in the 18th century, to serve as a mediator for the chiefs of the Giron, Tidog peoples. These are the indigenous peoples of northeastern Borneo, what is now part of mostly Kalimantan in Indonesia. And so Alimuddin was present in the treaty signing. He even led the Spaniards in raiding the territories of the Tidog peoples. And the signing of the treaty between the Tidog peoples and Spanish Philippines was likely mediated by the Sulu Sultan himself, because he was there. So in both Sulu and Maguindanao, it was a win-win solution on having these treaties. Spain would have local allies versus other hostile local enemies. And on the other hand, the local Maguindanao or Sulu ruler could maintain his political supremacy over rebellious subjects or jealous dynastic rivals. The same mutual interest in drawing up treaties could also be seen in the various polities. In Indonesia, in colonial Indonesia, they call it rakyas, meaning small kingdoms. So the act of signing of treaties of subjugation of these local Sulawesi datus with the Dutch East India Company effectively elevated the status of small villages as autonomous polities. Local village chiefs became quote-unquote rajas on paper and were freed from the frequent political and military interference from larger neighbors like the Sultanate of Ternate. In return, the VOC received a small annual tribute of either rice, gold, or coconut oil. The Dutch recognition of small villages as polities in their own right, which could enter into treaties, differed starkly with the Spanish experience in Mindanao and Sulu, where early treaties seemingly were forged only with the apical rulers, with the Sultan of Sulu and Mindanao. So you in Dutch Indonesia, treaties were signed even with the most probably say inconsequential village chiefs, but the Spanish seem to have a tendency to only negotiate and sign treaty with the Sultan, with the apical ruler, meaning the most important, the primus inter pares. And treaties, Spanish treaties with lesser chiefs, less important chiefs, were made through the mediation of Maguindanao or Sulu overlords. This had important consequences, I think, in the political trajectories of these two regions, meaning Mindanao and Sulawesi. The Spanish strategy contributed to the centralization of the sultanates, while the Dutch strategy, fragmented strategy of political signing treaties with smaller village chiefs, prevented the coalescing of small polities into larger units. For instance, North Sulawesi remained fragmented, but arguably more stable and less conflictual with each other. Next slide. Well, this is just an example of it's not a treaty but a letter. On the left hand side you see, well, you cannot see, but it's the Spanish version of the letter, and the other side is the Jawi version. So Jawi is the Arabic, right, form. No? So if you have a Southeast Asian language written in Arabic, that's Jawi. And in this letter, Sultan Muhammad Ali Muddin in 1780 is asking Spain to have a new treaty. So it was Sulu was asking for a new treaty of friendship with Spain. Next slide, please. The second thing I'd like to emphasize is that there is an active agency of local rulers in forging and re-examining treaties. First, I think it's important that you're all aware that there's the importance of blood compact, back to the sun with Sandugo. It was an established form of alliance making before European arrival. And we have recorded instances of Sandugo where parties draw blood mixed with palm wine. And you have examples from that from Surigao, from Leyte, from Bohol. Of course, the most famous between Lopez and Kaduna. The Spanish authorities were well aware that indigenous networks and alliance making continued despite their successful establishment of fort towns, presidial towns in Mindanao. So, for instance, in 1751 in northern Mindanao, the Alcalde Mayor, the governor of Iligan, was afraid, was worried that his own Maestro de Campo, an indigenous official who received salary from the Spanish colonial state and who has control over a significant number of men, was in collusion with or had a treaty with the Sultan of Maguindanao. So the arrival of Spain, in short, in Mindanao, did not prevent local chiefs in Mindanao to also have their treaties among themselves. Yeah? We do not know what kind of treaty that Maestro de Campo had with the Sultan, this indigenous Maestro de Campo had with the Sultan of Maguindanao. Could be a verbal, could be Sandugo, but in Spanish sources it's called a treaty. The VOC had solved this dilemma of surreptitious, clandestine, indigenous or fictive alliances or real alliances by including in the contract with the North Sulawesi Rajas limitations in overseas interactions. For instance, now in Article 8 of the contract between medyo boring, no? Okay, what contracts? But anyway, siguro, the point here is, when the Dutch arrived in Sulawesi, in Indonesia, they specified, I think, much more than the Spaniards, that these local chiefs in Sulawesi could not travel abroad, overseas, and make family with other local chiefs. Yeah? So their control is, is more palpable. May treaty na sila, even with these chiefs, which the Spaniards didn't do in Mindanao. But the advantage, of course, for the local Sulawesi Indonesian Raja chief is his position is secured. He cannot be contested by his neighbor, by his relative, by in a society which is constantly in political flux. That's important. Okay, but this did not mean, however, that the North Sulawesi Rajas had always been passive receivers of treaties in exchange for recognition and protection. In the 19th century, as the Dutch colonial government increasingly interfered in local affairs, some dissatisfied chiefs of the small polity of Pintauna expressed opposition to the contract that they signed with the colonial government because the colonial government banned debt bondage, and which had been one of the traditional ways of indigenous elites in extracting basically free labor from their subjects. So they're not happy, so they complain to the colonial government. By the 19th century, you have more modern ideas of governance, and they included, the colonial government included more, progressive provisions in the treaties, when, for instance, prohibition of slaves living in Indonesia in the 19th century, which was not included in the treaties in the earlier centuries of the 18th centuries, only about commerce or trade. Meanwhile, in Sulu and Mindanao, the relatively more autonomous rulers could make arguments on the very provisions of the treaty that they had just signed. In 1750, for instance, Sultan Bantilan of Sulu expressed his intention directly to the King of Spain, because the Spanish governor in Zamboanga had supposedly broken the treaty of peace between Sulu and Spain, and that Spain had also captured around 2,000 people from Sulu. So you have the Sultan of Sulu threatening to write directly to the King of Spain that his lower functionary in Zamboanga is not acting according to the provisions of the treaty. Sultan Alimuddin of Sulu in 1770s was also known to have closely examined all the written communication sent to him with the help of the English, with whom he had close alliance. This likely included letters from the Dutch, which sent overtures to sign an exclusive treaty of friendship and commerce to attempt to keep the English away from Sulu. So here you see the local rulers of Mindanao and Sulu were actively engaged in treaty making and were fully aware of the meanings and consequences of the treaties. The Sultans of Mindanao and Sulu employed translators. For instance, in Sulu you have English. In Sulawesi, it's usually the local Ambonese from one of the eastern islands of Indonesia, which had a long tradition of Christianity and literacy. So this local chiefs in Sulawesi employed these Christian schoolmasters, the Protestant schoolmasters, who taught Malay to the children of the local elite, and also served as scribes for the local chiefs when writing to the Dutch authorities based in the largest city of North Sulawesi, in Manado. The third theme, next slide please. Malapit na matapos. So the third theme is the validity of treaties. No? I think the treaties and contracts entered by local chiefs were generally honored, and their provisions were, I think, for the most part, followed. In the Spanish Philippines, for instance, it was noted in 1740 that after the series of treaties with the Sultans of Sulu and Mindanao, immediately there were no large raiding expeditions reported except for some opportunistic attacks from small raiding parties. It seems to me that the question on the validity of the treaties arises not because of the time elapsed, meaning masyado ng haba, but because of the way the treaty was originally signed. The presence or absence of signatories, presence of, say, the most influential chiefs. These qualities operate as councils. No? Sometimes we forget that the Sultan is not really, he doesn't have absolute authority. It's a flat-top pyramid. If you imagine the political authority, it's not a pyramid where you have the Sultan at the top, but it's a flat-top. The Sultan being just the first among equals. So in Sulu in 1750, one influential chief, Diliman, argued against the decision of then Sultan Alimuddin in permitting Spanish missionaries to occupy a small piece of land without consulting the chiefs. But the Spanish argued that it was just because that Bantilan was absent during the treaty signing or the deliberations for the treaty signing that they think that the treaty is still valid, notwithstanding Bantilan was absent. Contracting treaties without the permission from other equally or perhaps more powerful chiefs would be fatal. That's what happened to the Raja Buddha, the heir apparent of Maguindanao in 1733, who was killed by the Sultan 10 days after signing a treaty of alliance with the Spanish. The fourth theme, and I think this is something that I have just thought about and therefore less developed than others, is we see an increasing symmetry and inequality. If you look at, if you compare treaties signed in the 18th and 19th century, for instance, the treaty signed between Sulu and Spain in 1730s did not have provisions on tariffs. Yeah? So all vessels having the permission from the Sultan, a license, could trade anywhere in Spanish Philippines. But almost a century after, in the 1830s, you have another treaty between Spain and Sulu, and now you have provisions regarding tariff that ships coming from Sulu have to pay, I think, if I'm not mistaken, 2.5 of the value, percent of the value of the goods in Manila. And I'm not sure, I'll have to check, but I think only in selected ports by the 19th century that Sulu traders could enter the Philippines, unlike before, kahit saan sila. So you have a more an equal relationship, and also you see now instances, evidence in the archives of acts of subjugation. They have a term in Spanish, juramento, oath of allegiance. On the one hand, you have oath of allegiance being held, conducted between the Mindanao Datus and Spain, but you have written treaties with the Mindanao Datus and Spain. I'm not sure what the reason for that is, but maybe it's because of the Spanish perception that these two have different political and economic importance, with Mindanao Datus having more control over more land, over more people. And also, I think there's a greater inclination towards standardization of treaties signed. And we see that very clearly with the Dutch case. So dati medyo personalized pa yung mga treaties, but by the 19th century, and you'll see later, I think I have an example, typewritten, meron ng may template for the treaties. Meron silang basis, legal basis for colonialism. Hindi na siya individually negotiated. Because you have, especially in Indonesia, you have hundreds of perhaps even thousands of local chiefs. So probably the Dutch thought, maybe we should have, and they call it korte verklaring, short declaration. Okay, maybe just last couple of slides, just a reflection on sources. Next. Sorry, it should be the last. So this is an example of, they tapped it later, this Sulu Treaty of 1836. Next slide. So this is an example of that generic wording of treaties. Next. Yeah, juramento de sumisión. So, I think this is oath of submission of a Mindanao. And you can see the text is in Spanish, but they signed in Jawi, in Arabic script. But next, this 1884 treaty between the Spanish governor of Cotabato and some datus of Mindanao. This is a full version of the treaty, written in Jawi. But I don't know, we haven't tried. The problem is, we have these treaties, but we don't have much competence in reading them. And, there are several people in the project, and I'm working on mostly on Spanish, but some on Dutch. I haven't uploaded, but to read that. It's much easier to do research in the Dutch archives, whether it's in the Netherlands or in Indonesia, especially regarding the treaties, because the way the archives are organized, you have treaty books, treaty series. But if you go to the Spanish sources, Spanish archives in Manila, or even if you search online in Paris, online Spanish archives catalog, it's very hard. Maybe because, especially in the early period, 18th century, earlier periods, Spaniards did not put much importance on that written treaty. It's only later that they learned from these Northern Europeans that we have a better way of basically controlling and playing over these lands and peoples if we have a written treaty. And so, if you go to the archives, you cannot find these are the treaties, these are the tratados. You have to really go through the collections on Mindanao. It's geographically organized. Next slide. I think it's also interesting if you look into the treaties. This is from Indonesia, act of renewal of the treaties between. I think this is somewhere in Diliman, but you have, if you go, so you have seals. No, these are wax seals. I think on the left side, these are seals from the indigenous chiefs, and on the right side, you have seals from the Dutch government. But also in the previous slide, you have also seals. This is the Spanish, no? This is the seal from the Maguindanao, one of the Maguindanao datos, and the right from Spain. So another trajectory for research also is to look into the materiality of the treaties themselves. How the format, aside from doing internal criticism, industry, you can also do external criticism, paper, seals. Okay, I think that's it for now. Thank you very much. I hope you learned something.
So, ayun guys, do you guys have any questions in particular that you want to ask about this? Are there any people here from my former history 113 class? We had an entire module on Mindanao and Sulawesi. Do you remember? No, they're hiding. Check. Okay, so you guys think for a moment, right? And I will set up the mic over here, which is having a little bit of difficulty. So we'll have a moment so Sir can rest as well. And then we'll look for some answers afterwards. Any questions? Is there anyone here in particular who has an interest in Mindanao studies? Or, that si Ma'am. Ma'am Ana, baka may gusto kayong i-call na student. Recitation daw to. Okay, so while they're thinking, maybe they're shy. Are there? No? Ma'am Ana will have a question.
Thank you for the wonderful lecture, Ariel. Siguro nabanggit mo sa lecture mo na nagamit na leverage ng mga local rulers yung treaty making with the colonizers. Pero ito rin ba ay naka-undermine ng kanilang influence or authority over their subjects? Nagkaroon ba ng revolts ang mga subject? Na-perceive ba nila na pagiging, kumagawa parang betrayal, act of betrayal, yung kanilang pakikipag-co-op at pag-accommodate sa mga former colonizers? Thank you.
Yeah, very good question. Maybe I. Hello. Yeah, I don't know. Yes. Siguro I simplified it, oversimplified. Of course, not all cases that you have treaties having a positive impact on the continuity, on the health of the polity, in this case on sultanates. In fact, you have a case in 1730s in Maguindanao where you have one Raja Buddha, meaning heir apparent to the throne, who signed a treaty with Spain. Yeah? And after 10 days, he was violently attacked and killed by the legitimate sultan. So I think it's how do you put it? It's not individual subjects who revolt, but I think they're led by their chiefs. and that connection, who's the subject of who, I think depends on the provenance of yung family connections, village, yung chiefs. Yeah. But these are very hard questions that you can only answer with details if we're just starting. So yeah. So I hope I can answer more and give you more details in the coming years.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for your lecture. It's interesting, it's unique. I'd like to know who initiated treaty signing. Was it the imperialists, or were there also occasions when the local rulers suggested or more or less initiated treaty signing? That's one curiosity. The other one is, was there an attempt on the part of the local rulers to collectively seek treaty signing, or was it always an imperial power with a local ruler? I think I'm interested in knowing alliances that were formed by local rulers in order to get into treaty signing. Thank you.
Yeah. I think this is one of the very interesting. Thank you very much for the question. I think this is the challenge in Southeast Asian historiography. Yeah? How do we capture the indigenous voices? Because, I mean, these are all colonial documents, of course. Yeah? Although you can sort of extract some of the voices in these are their signatures, right? But on indigenous alliance making, this is very difficult to unravel or to discover in the archives, because these are family relationships, and in Indonesia, or especially in this region, Islam became a very important rallying point for alliance making, especially as a when the VOC was starting to decline, yeah, in the late 18th century, you also see at that period the rise of what you might call a pan-Islamic consciousness, in probably the Malay Indonesian archipelago. But as to who initiated, I think it will be a case-to-case basis. But usually, whenever there's a new ruler, there would be a new impulse for a signing of a contract. I'm not sure if I have answered, but yeah, thanks. Yes.
So, sir, thank you for the lecture. I was just wondering, earlier you mentioned about the Dutch archives being much easier to use. I wonder why the Spanish didn't really care much about, not care, but why they didn't seem to place much importance on local treaties until a bit later, in comparison to the Dutch, who seem to have been consistent from the very start.
Yeah. Yes, that's a very good question. And one of the persons in the project, she's Mexican, and she says, and she's looking also at the Philippine case for the first time. And one Dutch colleague was presenting all these treaties between the Dutch and Indonesian rulers. And why don't we have this in the Philippines when we have very early, early colonialism, right? And she said, also in Latin America. Yeah. And so I suspect that maybe it's everything was verbal, yeah? Like what they did with the Maranao Datus that I showed. Maybe it's more of the Monumento de Submission rather than treaty making, treaties. And the Dutch were really at the forefront of making treaties at a very early period. Yeah. And even the Dutch archives today, they're quite accessible. You don't have to go to The Hague. Actually, you can sit in your room and read the archives. The entire VOC archives that you'll find in The Hague, several kilometers, are all online. And also some parts of the Indonesian archives. I know that the Spanish archives and documents in Spain are also partly digitized, but the ones by the Dutch, imagine that's 200 years of Indonesian history that you can just download online. But of course, may challenge of transcription and also challenge of translation. But if you want, actually I'm not teaching any Dutch, so probably starting Dutch reading.
Well, yeah, actually, I was thinking about asking next, sir, for those people who would be interested, of course, our main limitation is we don't know the language. And what are the ways that students could potentially start preparing themselves to enter this area of research? Because potentially for some students, this is very new. And they might be interested in exploring it later. So what do they do? Would they get into like a language class or read? What secondary sources should they read?
Yeah. Well, it depends what you want to explore, diba? If you want to explore the treaties, Spanish language treaties, then go deeply more to Spanish. But I think the challenge, admittedly, I'm trying in my class with in Pibagyo to also decipher the Jawi stuff. We don't know that. It's very hard. So it's a mixture of. I think that's more of the challenge. Not so much the ones written in Latin Roman script, but really the ones in Jawi. Yeah. Because the language is a mixture of Malay, if it's in Fungsu, of course also if it's in Maguindanao language. Yeah. But I think mostly Malay. So maraming, I don't know. But I think that's the beauty of doing research. You don't know what you'll encounter at the very beginning. And in the beginning, medyo malaki yung barrier, yung gap, but fulfilling.
Thank you so much, sir. Any questions from the class? Sets? See, Sir Joel has a question in the back. Would you mind coming maybe here in front of the camera para the mic can reach you?
Hi, sir.
About here, sorry.
Oh, okay. Hi, sir. Sir, I'm interested on the definition of terms. I mean, was it really treaty that is indicated in the primary sources or just mere agreement? Because, I mean, these two terms are different. I mean, in legal and political sense. But I'm just interested to know what is it that is, what concept that the sources use to refer to quote-unquote treaties.
Yes.
Yeah. So, like for instance, in Dutch, in the local language, buen tratado is that right? In Spanish, and also in Sultan. So, and what is the implication of that? That term for us to understand the so-called treaties, quote-unquote. So, yes.
Very good question. This is something, I think this is, well, in modern, the modern definition of treaties is it's a negotiation, product of written, dapat palaging may black and white, no? And it has to be between at least two parties and governed by international law. Yeah. So if it's done via outside, the rules of international law, then it's not valid. That's the modern definition of treaties. But we're looking into treaties done in the early modern, pre-modern period. And so our definition would be more flexible. And this is also a continuing conversation, even within the small research group that I'm part of. Halimbawa, does act, no? Or acta in Dutch, or acta in Spanish, are they equivalent? Is tratado in Spanish the same as the Dutch contract? We don't know yet. Kasi wala pa we don't know. It would be interesting paper exercise to see whether there's commensurability in definition, whether these Europeans meant the same. Or are they reading the same law books back in Europe? Just translating from Latin or what? When we see the sort of flurry of treaty making in the 19th century, it seems that the Spaniards were just catching up with other Europeans, and there's probably some legal current that was in Europe. So maraming levels, no? Semantic level na whether the Europeans were whether they understood each other. Of course, they use different languages. Right? That's one question, and also whether these, to what extent the indigenous rulers understood the full meaning, the legal implications.
Thank you, sir.
What international? Yes.
I was just saying thank you.
Okay. Sige na. I think my question is
Okay, yeah. Sorry, could you come in front? Hindi kasi aabot yung in wider.
Hello. I have two questions for you. The first one is that I think an assumption that I got from the lecture was that these treaties were poised towards stronger chief polities, meaning that you said smaller polities were fractured. So my question was about their survivability over time. I think you mentioned that they still thrived somewhat, but did these less interested communities become more open to, for example, subjugation from warring tribes? Did they adapt, or etc., considering how much benefit the more centralized communities receive? And secondly, since this is considerably underreported treaties about Mindanao and Sulawesi, how can we, or potentially yourself and the academy, prevent this with the grounded historical narrative in mainstream history, considering especially now that we have the resources, especially through treaties.org, which is now incredibly critical and very discernible nowadays?
Yeah, we had very good questions. Yung first, I propose
the survivability of more fractured.
Yeah.
The survivability of more fractured communities, ones that weren't given treaties from the Dutch or the Spanish, considering that the assumption I had from the lecture was that the Dutch and the Spanish were more interested in stronger chief families. What happened then to these fractured, or rather uninterested chief families, chief tribes?
Yeah. Thank you. Very interesting questions. When I looked at Mindanao and Sulawesi, I was struck by how peaceful the history of North Sulawesi, specifically North Sulawesi, is compared to Mindanao, Muslim Mindanao. And maybe the answer is partly because of those treaties that the Dutch had contracted with the small Sulawesi politics at a very early period. So they don't have to. So the bigger sultanates, neighboring sultanates like Sulu, Maguindanao, Ternate, Makassar, right? They don't dare to touch these North Sulawesi polities because their security is underpinned by the naval power of the Dutch through those treaties. Yeah, so they survived and relatively peaceful. Meanwhile, in Spanish Philippines, maybe because, and this is just a theory and could easily be, probably be debunked, but I think the reliance of the Spanish on the very few, on just the two basically, the Sultan of Cebu and Sultan of Maguindanao. And they did sign treaties with small polities like Cebu and Siasi, so you only see treaties with those polities in the 19th century. Yeah. So they did survive as independent polities, but they gobbled up by Cebu and Maguindanao respectively. Yeah. And as kung paano ito mabago yung ating grand narratives. Well, just think about the constant warfare between Spain and the Moros. With these treaties, it's easily Diliman puro Moro wars, right? Because at least actually a good number of period where peace and commerce between Spanish Philippines and the South.
Thank you very much.
But also, I think we have to, for a very long time, yung narrative natin ng European colonialism in Southeast Asia is always black and white, right? Everything colonial is negative. That's one thing to debunk, but I think also the way we look at history and treaties, I think there's other more interesting ways. Maybe looking at the history of this region through treaties is just one entry point, and maybe we can discover more ways of maybe if we look at those treaties, we see the role of women. It's a very big probability. Okay.
We have another question over here, and then one more after that.
Thank you for the lecture. I just want to ask you, since you mentioned earlier that they use translators whenever they're reading these treaties. Just want to ask how exactly were they able to bridge that language barrier, and were these translators came from these regions, or were they from the Spaniards? Because most of the texts are in Spanish, even though it's signed by the Sultan. So is it possible that these families were taken advantage of, since they're not that well versed in the language, and these treaties have very specific provisions that I think require understanding of the language?
Yeah. What we know, from say in the Spanish Philippines, very good question. We know very little about those interpreters, translators. We need more studies. And I've already seen some documents in the National Archives in Manila, expedientes on these interpreters. And their salary, the Spaniards pay them. And they have Spanish names. in Indonesia, they're also salaried. They receive funding from the Dutch East India Company as religious teachers and also as scribes. Religious teachers. So, yung conception natin that the Dutch were only concerned about commerce, actually they also inverted. They sent out indigenous Malukan from Eastern Indonesia, from Bangkok. School teachers, Malay naman yung gamit. And actually they're the most effective spreader of Malay language.
Thank you, sir. So there's another question here from one of our colleagues, Professor Diliman.
Sir, I'm just curious if most of the treaties forged during this period are economic or trade driven. Because the way I see it based on the presentation, from the perspective of the colonizers or from the perspective of the imperialists, it was mainly economic. But for the local rulers, it's really political. Because in the present period, we have a various kinds of treaties nowadays. Some are just political, some are just economic. So I'm just curious if, from the perspective of the colonizers back then, particularly the VOC, and also from the Spanish colonizers or forging treaties down south, was it mainly economic or economic oriented or trade driven?
Thank you. Good question. I think for the VOC case, it's mainly economic, but they also want to keep out competition from other Europeans, Spanish, English specifically. So they want to make sure that those local chiefs would not trade, would not have a relationship with other Europeans. So it's political as well, but mainly economic. To protect their monopoly of spice trade in Eastern Indonesia. In the case of Spain, I think you see a more of a mixture of politics, even religion, coming. So in some treaties you have provisions that say the Sultan should allow the settlement building of a church in his politics that needs to make. So I think it's more mixed in the Spanish side, but more pronounced economically in the Dutch side.
Thank you, sir. So we're looking to have maybe one or two more questions for Sir Ariel. Anyone here in the back? Baka naman hindi ko kayo nakita kanina. Questions here? Yeah? Sorry, you're gonna have to move here.
Good afternoon, Professor. So, my question is that, from my understanding is that there seems to be an existence of parity between, at least some bargaining power between the local indigenous peoples and the colonizers during this time, with the existence of the treaty itself. But my question is there evidence that these treaties were actually enforced? Whether the enforcement or the demand for enforcement comes from the local indigenous peoples or from the colonizers?
They're enforced. Just recently, I found an example of a shipping license. So in the treaties between Spain and Sulu, ships coming to Spanish Philippines from Sulu should have a shipping license, meaning a written permission to the Sultan that this is from Sulu. So they have it. Legitimate traders should carry those licenses from the Sultan to whenever they trade to Spanish Philippines. So it's, I think, generally recognized. But yeah, I think more in the Dutch case, I think use it. I think they have a more, maybe I'm wrong. Yes, but I'll tell you more when when I read when we read all the treaties, but that's my perception that they're generally recognized, at least by those sitting in controlling the most important port cities. Yeah. Say Zamboanga, Iloilo, Taguig.
Alright, from the back there, any other questions? Okay. Oh, sir. Oh, yes. Ay, sorry. Magkatawag ka na tayo.
Good afternoon, sir. I am Jeff for a fourth-year history student. Sir, I would like to ask you, given that it's about treaties, is that with the whole, if they come into agreements, usually they sign that agreement or the so, sir, within the treaties that we have searched for or discovered, sir, meron po bang evolution on how suited sign? Kasi po, di ba, for example, during the Cordilleras, when indigenous people sign contracts with the Americans or the Spanish, they usually use their contracts because they didn't know how, or they don't have any fixed personalized images. So is it the same case for Venezuela, where, for example, early treaties would show parts of the circles, or was it consistent throughout the they have a personalized sign?
Very good question. Pwede makakopya nung video to present to the questions. But in the case of the Southern Philippines, if it's with a treaty with the Sultan would always have a seal. And every Sultan would have a different seal. That's a mark of their regnal silver. And as for the signature, wala pa akong nakita stamp mark, right? But I think if you look at more simple signatures, writing in Jawi, that might mean that the signatory is probably less educated or not really, it's not efficient in Jawi. I think I've seen a thumb mark in Indonesia in one of those countries in Europe.
Thank you, sir.
Alright, maybe one last question and then oh, there are two of you! Okay, sige. So, sabi niya, ikaw daw muna, Jera. So, you're gonna have to move here a little bit because the mic won't reach there. Yeah. Sige.
Hello sir, so question ko na is, di ba ang treaties ay supposedly equal sa both parties. So, ang tanong ko is, may nakita na po ba kayo sa mga transcribe or na-analyze yung mga treaties na mukhang hindi siya equal, particularly mas agrabyado ang mga sa Mindanao and Lopez, may mga ganang instances na diba?
Yeah. Well, treaties don't have to be equal.
Pwedeng sample po.
Sample.
Kung ano yung mga nakita niyo na hindi.
Well, yung sample ng I think yung theme 4, yeah. Where you have a more so you can only say more unequal if you have a reference, diba, back in time. And yung example ko, 1737 and 1836, in those two treaties between Sulu and Spain, you see a more increasing power asymmetry and equal relationship. I haven't looked into the words, but you can. I've just discussed this with Apudin na in the 18th century treaty, they used the word potencia, referring to the Sulu Sultan, Sulu Sultan, and referring to power. And I think that's not present in the 19th century, the 18th to 30s version. Good. But very good question. Yeah, I'll take both of these questions.
Thank you po, sir.
Good. Sige. Maraming salamat.
Yeah, and on that note, let's give a very big round of applause. And sir, as a very, very small token of appreciation, we're gonna have Ma'am Anna here give you just a certificate for stakes for today's lecture. Ayan. And some gifts as well from the Cordillera Study Center. Sige, kayo na as the more professorial among us. Okay.
We would like to thank Dr. Ariel C. Lopez for sharing their time and expertise as the key resource speaker on treaties and indigenous political interests in Mindanao and Sulawesi circa 1700 to 1900, a public lecture at the College of Social Sciences, University of the Philippines, Baguio on April 12, 2023. Signed by our chairperson, Dr. Maria Nela D. Falendo of the Department of History and Philosophy, and our dean, Dr. Lea E. Abayao of the College of Social Sciences.
Okay, so thank you again, sir. Thank you to our audience who stayed today, our colleagues as well as students and other people who might have wanted to walk in and see what is happening today. No? After this, we have some merienda and also some coffee outside. But yeah, you may need tayo. So if you have other questions or if you want to talk to Sir more, he might be available during that time as well with our short merienda. Okay. Again, thank you guys so much again for coming today, and we'll see you at the next CSS Public Lecture.